Welcome to the Unity Guides Expert Interview Series. My name is Clayton Stenson. I'll be your host today. This series is brought to you by the Unity Guide, where we help develop Unity within companies running on the entrepreneurial operating system. We do this through fractional integrator services and coaching for the visionary and integrator, as well as their leadership team. So recently have been meeting so many amazing people, and I thought there has to be a way I can take a piece of the conversations I have week in and week out and share them with the business community to add value. And one of those amazing people that I know is Tim Spiker. Tim and I met after I read his book, The Only Leaders Worth Following. And I was so impacted by it that I reached out cold on LinkedIn and we connected for a chat, and a relationship has developed since. So today I'm excited to have you on and to talk about your book a little bit. So welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Clayton. This is fun. You and I have gotten to develop this friendship over the last year or so. And so it's so much fun to engage in dialogue. And we always seem to, try to put 20 pounds of sugar in a 10-pound bag. So here we go.
We'll try to keep this to 30 minutes,
Yeah.
but it's going to be challenging. So
Yeah.
let's get right into it. So Tim, tell us about your book and why you decided to write it.
Well, the short answer about why I wrote it is basically because I had to. And I imagine that there's a lot of authors that feel that way, that there's this thing that's inside of you that you're passionate about, that you believe has been helpful to you, that would be helpful to others. And so you just want to get it out. And it's also for the sake of time, which sounds like a fairly, not so inspiring reason. But what I found was I'm having 2 hour conversation after 2 hour conversation after 2 hour conversation about this research and these principles that we talk about in the book. And you can imagine that's a pretty slow way to get an important message out. So
Mhm.
at a certain point, it just said, basic logic of economies of scale. Let's get this down. So what I could do is hand it to somebody and say, hey, give this a look, and then let's pick up the conversation from there. So there's also a very practical side
Yeah.
to getting a book out in terms of going further faster with regard to the conversation. There might be some people out there who I didn't mean to steal that phrase right there, but some people might know where that came from. So I'm not trying to hijack anybody's other really good taglines, but it's true. So
That's awesome. And so you mentioned research, and I read a lot of books, and sometimes it's someone's opinion or their perspective, but that's one thing I really appreciated about your book is that it is based on research. So tell us about the research. And
So I was working for a leadership development portion of a consulting firm, and we would have people up to the west side of Pikes Peak here in the United States in Colorado for a week at a time. And we put them through a number of assessments. And over time, the clients began to ask, what is the magic mix within these assessments that tells me that I probably have a wonderful future as a leader? Or could I give these assessments to some people that we're taking a look at to consider for promotion, and that will predictively tell us whether or not they're going to excel as a leader? And so we had enough data through these assessments to run the analysis. And my colleague Vanessa Kiley, she put the SPSS software through its paces and put all of these assessments together to look for correlations. And so that was the genesis of where the research started from, was just wanting to answer a question that our clients were asking us.
what did the research say?
Well, this part of the story I rather like because we found something that we weren't looking for. And so I'm not suggesting that if somebody has a hypothesis and they test it and they find it to be true, I'm not suggesting that they're necessarily lying, but we did not have the hypothesis around anything to do with what we ended up with. So we were just looking for correlations between these three assessments. We had a personality assessment, we had a natural ability assessment, and we had a leadership 360. And what the software kicked back to Vanessa and said is basically you're looking in the wrong place. because there is no correlation between any personality type and leadership success.
Hmm.
There is no correlation between any natural ability and leadership success. And furthermore, there's no correlation between a combination of those things and leadership success. But in an act of desperation, as she was finding nothing, she said to SPSS, "Go find anything. Literally look for correlations anywhere you can find them." And that's when it essentially said, ignore those first two assessments. The thing that you're going to find that actually has a correlation is within your 360. And so within that leadership 360, we were measuring 8 different areas. And what the analysis kicked back is that just 2 of those 8 areas were driving 77% of the variability on the entire 360. So if you think about a pizza, hopefully that is something that is familiar to everybody. If not, I would suggest you hit pause right now and go rectify that situation immediately. But if you think about the normal cut on a pizza here, so not the square cut that I have become fond of as a father, as we're doling out small pieces of pizza, but the normal cut, you can imagine that circle divided up into 8 equal slices. And we all know what that looks like. And now imagine that 2 of those 8 slices took up 77% of the pizza. Those are 2 really big slices of pizza. That's the piece that my 14-year-old son would, form tackle his mother in order to get. So ultimately what we found is 2 of the aspects of leadership that we were measuring were much more important than the other 6 combined. And that was what we stumbled across in the midst of this research.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love that there was no agenda. No, you're not trying to prove something. You just stumbled across this. So what were those 2 things?
So the 2 aspects that were driving 77%, or if you want to shorthand it, 3/4 of the variability in the assessment of these leaders, those 2 areas were inwardly sound and others focused. And, somebody might be saying, well, what were the other qualities that were there? Which is a fair question. So the other things were setting direction, aligning resources, motivation and inspiration, execution and follow through, developing talent. These were really, I would say that's kind of a who's who of the normal leadership literature. And nothing against any of those things. Give me multiple books on all of those subjects. I'm going to gobble them up because I think there's really interesting stuff around all of it. But ultimately, what it kicked back to us is that those 6 were worth 23%, those typical things that we talk about leadership, and yet these other 2, inwardly sound and others focused, were worth 77%. So I'm going to save if I can. I'm just going to fast forward. We're going to do the time warp thing here. I'm going to save everybody 3 years because that's how long it took the light bulb to come on for me. We had the research and we were looking at it, and we had everything that I've just shared with you, but it took me 3 years to see the most salient conclusion, which probably people listening are like, I can already hear the end of this story coming. So it took me 3 years. So at any rate, I was sitting in my office one day, I was thinking about this research and this model, and it dawned on me that all of those other aspects of leadership that I just mentioned are about what leaders do. But these 2 qualities that made up just over 3/4 were about who you are as a person. And that was when the light bulb went on with a very simple phrase that 3/4 of our effectiveness as leaders comes from who we are, not what we do. And that is not to vilify what we do. That is instead to say what we do is deeply influenced by how well developed we are as human beings. It has that inwardly sound and others focused, those components really are the fuel or the lack of fuel to the things that we do as a leader. Therefore, they have an outsized influence on our effectiveness as leaders.
That's awesome. I remember, and I'm just gonna be real vulnerable here. Like I remember when I was listening to your book, and I was just so emotionally impacted by it. because I think, um, after being in leadership roles for 15 years and having, different leaders over the years, uh, I just think it resonated, right? It was like, this is true, right? Like this is true. This is so aligned with how I feel I've grown as a leader over the years as I've become more and more healthy and dealt with my own inner
Mm.
stuff, right? And become less insecure, more secure, right? And just able to like be in a situation and not worry about me, right? Like
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
I tell people often, like, I'm most effective as a coach when I don't think about myself at all, right? Like
Yeah.
if person I'm coaching, if I'm like insecure, what is he thinking? Like I can't be as effective. Like, it doesn't mean it's not going to be good, but it's not going to be great, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's
You
well
know?
said.
And so like I come into a coaching call if I'm feeling some insecurity, for me,
Mm.
I'm a person of faith. So I pray, I ask God to help me to let go
Mm.
of
Mm.
myself and be fully present for Tim or whoever it is that I'm coaching,
Hmm.
and let go of myself. And like, so that's both inwardly sound and others focused.
Yeah, definitely a connection point there. One of the things when we talk about humility, which in our model lands on the others focus side of things, but certainly there's connections to insecurity, which lands on the inwardly sound side of things.
Yeah.
But when we talk about humility, one of the things we talk about is self-forgetfulness. So, and that's not a terminology that we invented. We actually got it from C.S. Lewis,
Hmm.
because he in his book, The Screw Tape Letters, he talks about
Yeah.
self forgetfulness as tied to humility. And
Mm.
so, what if I'm not on the line here at all? What if this is just about others? What if this is just about the mission that we're here for, and it's not at all about whether or not I'm approved of or liked or patted on the back or lauded or whatever it is that we might need in order to feel a sense of security. What if that was all off the table, decided and not relevant?
Hmm.
How would the collective globe of leaders, how would we operate differently
Hmm.
and better if we weren't trying to prove ourselves
Hmm.
necessarily, but there just to serve and be helpful. So I love your prayer.
Hmm.
I think it's spot on for a number of different things, but at the top of the list is
Hmm.
being able to help people, this is something that leaders need to be doing.
Hmm. And what just came to mind too is like in a larger context, like a leadership team or something, when you're thinking about yourself and positioning yourself and, trying to gain advantage, right? Like that undermines everything, right? So if you're
Yeah.
able to just, what, I'm here for the best interest of the company and the group, and,
Mhm.
I'm present and it's not about me, I think that also, is a beautiful thing that leads to success as a leadership team as well. So how does one become, we'll start with the first one, inwardly sound? I'm just curious what your perspective is on that.
Well, at a certain level, the answer with both of them, I'm going to actually bring them together for this answer.
Okay.
So both
Sure.
inwardly sound and others focus. It begins with a willingness to look in the mirror, which is extraordinarily easier to say than it is to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we start there. But there's three elements that we have found that are absolutely critical if you want to do what we call who-based development. So, we can nod to Cindy Lou Who here in Whoville, Dr. Seuss. Um, but if we're going to acknowledge that the research says that 77% of our effectiveness comes from who we are, then we have to think very intentionally about how do you develop who, because it's different than learning a skill. It's
Mm-hmm.
different. It's even different than understanding. There's some great books out there around strategy. I'll date myself here a little bit, but Blue Ocean Strategy was a wonderful book around how can I be in a space where there's nobody else. Those are really important and valuable leadership texts to engage with,
Mm-hmm.
but it is different than working on the inner core of who I am as a leader, or who you are. And so the three elements that we have found that we believe need to be present to do really great who-based development are just an acronym that we use called DCT, which stands for depth, community, and time. We believe that those three elements are absolutely necessary to do really high quality who-based development. And if you lose any one of those three, you lose something that's really important in the development of who we are.
That's awesome. Depth, community, and time. So you say you have to look in the mirror, but you depth meaning
Yeah.
you need to go, you need to go deep. Like you need to do the work, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we talk about with depth is we've got to be willing to pick up the rocks of action and look underneath to see motives, perspectives, intent. It's not just enough for us if we're going to do who-based development. That's a big if, because if you want to do what I might call typical leadership development, looking under the rock is not quite as necessary because you're just analyzing action and
Mm-hmm.
you're not necessarily looking at the why behind the action. But if you're going to do who-based development, you've got to look under that rock and
Mm-hmm.
say, really, really, what was my motive? What was my perspective? What's the worldview that I bring into this activity? So depth for us is saying ultimately we can't stop at the action. We've got to look underneath that. On the, I'll just get on a roll here and go to the other two. On the community side of things, there's a number of different things that are important around community. If I'm 6 times more likely to show up for my workout if I've got a workout partner, community plays a role in this. This is hard work. Working on who you are is not easy. So doing it alongside others has an accountability to it to say, I'm going to continue to show up and engage in the work. But there's other things about community that are valuable as well. For example, as I travel along, and let's just say, I'm going to pick one of the aspects of being others focused. Let's just take curious. If if for the next if for the next 10 weeks or 10 months or 10 years, I'm working on becoming more curious, to have people around me and I get to watch their story unfold at the same time as well. Well, that's going to fast forward my own development because now we're not just going off of my experience. We're learning from watching others as well. But what also happens in the community space is people get to chime into my experience as I share it with them. Here's a meeting. My intention during this meeting was to be really open and curious. I was going to ask a lot of questions, but halfway through, Billy said that thing that he always says, and it got me all torqued off. And then I didn't ask another question in the rest of the meeting.
Right. And you went
So,
internal probably. Right.
yeah, yeah. So to be able to share that with other people and have them say, somebody might say, "Hey, you know what? 3 weeks ago, that same thing happened to you. And you know what? If I'm remembering correctly, I think that was also Billy. So is there maybe something in your world where you're able to be curious around lots of other people, but for some reason, Billy trips your triggers? Is
Mm-hmm.
there anything to that?" And maybe the answer is no, there's nothing to that. But to have other people around us who can help
Mm-hmm.
us look for patterns that we might not see ourselves. That's another part of community. And then time is the one that everybody hates. You know, Everybody wants the easy button or the
Yeah.
pill.
The
And
microwave
it
culture that we,
Yeah, the microwave, right? Sorry, folks, this is a crock pot. I mean, and so we need time because we need a variety of contexts in which to practice. One of the things that we share with our clients, we'll get together every 10 to 13 weeks to transition to another aspect of who to work on. But what I consistently tell them and thoroughly believe is the most important thing that happens is not when I'm here with you, it's when I'm not with you. It's that time in the saddle that we need. I'm going to put on lenses. I'll just stick with curious. I'm going to put on the curious lenses and look at my leadership in a very focused way for 2.5 to 3 months around when I'm curious and when I'm not as a leader. We need time for that. I might have a 2-week vacation in the midst of that. And by the way, since we're working on the whole of who we are, the work doesn't stop when you go on vacation. We're as we're recording this, we're coming up on the holidays. I mean,
Mhm.
go ahead. Let's throw interesting family dynamics in the mix and let's watch.
There's a
Let's.
Billy in the family as
I mean, there's something to learn there. Yeah, but we need time. We need time. The truth is, these qualities take a lifetime to actually develop and master.
well.
But this is why with our clients, for the most part, we don't go in and do like a series of 2-hour talks and we're out of there in a couple of
Right.
months because we don't think that we'll make a big difference for them.
Right.
We might help them get kicked off on something with a talk, but ultimately we all need time
Hmm.
as we're growing and developing in who we are. So depth, community, and time. We believe that that group of three, DCT, is absolutely necessary to do really high quality who-based development.
I'd like to share something that I think is an example of this, and it's my own life. So I was not a person that was able to talk about feelings or have any kind of awareness of what was going on inside of me. And then I, became a part of the church, and thankfully I learned that there. But it was interesting when I was involved there. My leader there reminded me so much of my dad. My dad was,
Wow.
was very task focused and not relationship focused. And I didn't really have a great relationship with my dad from probably age 10 to 25. And it was interesting. Like he triggered me, right, to remind me of my dad. And
Mm.
so it was interesting because I started to notice this. And as I was working on myself in those years, I started to recognize that, there was something here that needed to be healed.
Mm.
Right. And over time, I was able to forgive my dad. And I was able to, actually it took quite a bit of time, right, to be able to forgive my dad, firstly. And then
Mhm.
it took quite a bit of time for me to be able to fully forgive this leader, this visionary that I worked with. It was my first visionary. And, but it was such like it was such an amazing journey. And now I can say, like, those people don't trigger me anymore. Like, that
Mm.
type of person doesn't trigger me anymore. In fact, I coach those people now, which is
Yeah.
which is interesting. And I coach people on how to work with visionaries. But it all came because of my own who development over really 15, 16 years, right? And so I think it's an example, right, of what can happen. And I think that's probably why it resonated so much, right? Because I was so far down the journey. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you say it resonates, I feel a lot of gratitude to hear that. And what I also know, and this is going to maybe sound weird from the author, but it resonates with me too. I mean, it resonates with my experiences.
Mm-hmm,
I first came at it from a research standpoint. As we heard the story there, it wasn't like
mm-hmm,
we had something that we were after.
mm-hmm,
But once the data put the sign in front of us,
mm-hmm.
then I started looking back on things. I'm like, oh my goodness, well, that explains that, and that explains that, and that
Yeah.
explains that, and that explains that. And that has been my experience with other leaders for, you
Mm-hmm,
know, 15, 18 years at this point,
mm-hmm.
where it becomes an explanation for so many of the things that we've experienced, both good and bad. And you take something like forgiveness. I'm glad you brought that one up because it's really interesting to look at something like that. Here's the crazy thing. You're talking about relationships and what triggers me and what, when I'm triggered, I'm essentially heading towards some level of mental incapacitation or just not even being able to see a situation for what it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing it through these lenses. And so there is an organization based out of Minneapolis here in the US called KRW. And they published an article in the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago about what they measured as return on assets. So all of a sudden now I'm kind of like, well, wait a second. I thought we were talking about relationships. And now Tim is talking about financial terms. What gives here? Well, here's what they found. They actually measured, among other things, forgiveness in the executive levels of an organization, which to me, like, I just give them a
Wow.
clap right there for being bold
Wow.
enough to
Yeah.
walk into for-profit businesses and say, we're going to look at the issue of forgiveness. They did that forgiveness alongside other who-based qualities that they measured. They found that leaders and leadership teams, the top of organizations that had the greatest amounts of forgiveness, had a return on assets almost 5 times that of the bottom group of organizations that they measured, almost 5 times. So to think about, like, ultimately, how does all of this work? I think it comes back to it, and many listeners might be familiar with it. There's tons of research out there, as in over 400 studies now, that connect engagement to performance. And
Mhm.
so the bottom line of why does we call this whole thing that we're talking about, by the way, the who, not what principle. The reason that it exists, how it works, is that when we are more inwardly sound and others focused as leaders, we are more trustworthy, ultimately. When I'm showing up for you and I'm not bringing so much inward sound damage, when I'm not showing up with, copious amounts of insecurity and that type of thing, I'm a more trustworthy leader. When I'm more trustworthy, guess what happens? People are more engaged. And when they are more engaged, they produce a better result. So it's not a super complicated equation. There's a few steps there, but this is why who we are as leaders matters so much. And so that's why an organization like KRW can publish a research study in Harvard Business Review that lists something like forgiveness as a quality that's contributing to a 5 times greater return on assets. So, at the face value, you hear that and you're like, what kind of crazy talk is this? But if you really break it down, it's actually not that crazy. It's actually, it makes sense. When we all think about the leaders that we have loved to follow, we gave them everything that we got, we gave them everything that we had, and we were excited to do it. And what happens when people give all that they have? They produce a better
Okay,
result.
so
It's not that complicated.
yeah, and I would say too, like it's interesting what just came to mind is that when we're trustworthy, what do? We let down our guard, right? Or sorry,
Mhm.
when I'm trustworthy, my people that report to me let down their guard,
Right.
right? Which allows us to go into depth, right? Like that's one of the challenges that I find as a leader is getting people to open up, right? Like because I can help them. The more they open up, the more I can help them, right?
Hmm.
Can go
Yeah.
deeper. There's a more of a sense of community, right?
Hmm.
And over time, we have a greater impact on their life, right? So when we jumped on the call today, I told you about one of my friends that I actually did his premarital coaching before he got married, and he texted me last summer. He's like, Clayton, I keep getting promoted. And I'm freaking out. Can you coach me? Right. And there's a depth of trust there. And so when I met
Yeah.
him, I said, what do you want coaching on? And he gave me 12 things
Oh, wow.
that he's not good at. And I was like, this is interesting, right? Like that's never happened in a coaching context. Generally, I'm trying, like I had one client where I needed to do a 360 review to determine what he needed coaching on because he just seemed like he had it all figured out, right?
Mhm.
Whereas this guy comes probably because of trust and relationship with a list of 12 things, willing to just bare his soul and be completely humble on what he needs work on. Uh,
Yeah.
so that allows me to lead him, depth. But what came first was the trust.
Yeah. You had a relationship that allowed him to open up and say these things. And, it's interesting. Sometimes you hear stories about people in leadership positions who will get upset with people for not extending them trust. And I find that, I've actually experienced this personally. I find it incredibly ironic because I really think our response to that in our healthiest selves would be better. If somebody says to you, hey, look, I don't trust you enough to talk about that. I don't trust you enough to share that. Go ahead, get mad if you want to. But the better reaction within the mirror as we talk to ourselves is, what have I fostered here that doesn't allow this person
Yeah. What can I do to help
to
you
share
best?
with me? What have I done and what could I do differently? And
Yeah.
I was planning to leave a job at one point in my career, and I didn't trust my boss. I didn't know how he would use that information. In fact, I was pretty confident it would be used against me, and it turned out in the end that there was some truth to that. But when I confessed that I was thinking about leaving the company, he got real mad at me. And I'm like, I mean, maybe there's another way to look at this.
Right.
Maybe we should ask the question, why do I not trust you?
Right.
And it does the look, relationships. We can talk about strategy all day long. And I love strategy.
Mm.
But a great strategy in the long run is never going to outpace bad relationships ever.
Hmm.
It can't, it won't. You have the perfect strategy and nobody wants to run forward with you. So
Hmm.
guess what happens to that great strategy? Nothing happens with that great strategy.
Hmm.
We have to understand that relationships precede all of our great strategic ideas. And so we've got to feed into what great relationships look like, which is ultimately what these two things do. Really, I tell people sometimes, like, oh, we can talk about all the nuances. Ultimately, inwardly sound and others focused is about how to have great relationships, which, by the way, includes sometimes holding people accountable to standards and raising them. When
Yeah.
I talk with people about the best leaders they've ever followed, almost every time they talk about somebody who pulled them to a different level than they
Yeah.
thought they were capable of. So this isn't about, we're just going to play ping pong in the break room and give each other hugs. This is about people who both care for us deeply and challenge us. They're
Hmm.
not willing to let us kind of languish in mediocrity. And so they pull us forward. So none of this precludes accountability and performance. In fact, it fuels it. It literally does the opposite of what some people assume.
Yeah, that's really good. I just want to share quickly about a book that I read and how it's impacted me as well. There's a book, it's not about this at all, interestingly enough. It's a book called The Perfect Close by James Muir, and it's about sales, right? And I read it, and there's a section in there that talks about how in sales, intent matters more than technique. And what he says is that if you come into a sales call and your goal is to sell, your intent is to sell the person whatever you are selling, right? They can tell, they can sense it, even if you don't say it. Obviously, you wouldn't say it, but like there's micro expressions. There's just like ways that you can just tell that the
Yep.
person doesn't really care about you. They just want to sell. Uh, and so
Yeah.
right? Like you're laughing because you experienced it, right? You've been on calls
100%.
before. It's like there's no way I'm buying from this person because they
Right.
don't care about me at all, right? And I read that and I was like, oh, that really helped me in my sales, in my approach to sales. Like now when I'm in a meeting, it's like, hey, how can I help this person? How can I add value? How can I, I genuinely want to help them. And sometimes at the end of the call, it's like, you don't need me. You need
Hmm.
Tim, or you need this person.
Hmm.
They're better suited to serve you. And I'll do that, right? Because
Hmm.
that's my intent, is to help. Right. And I've transferred that over to leadership, right? Because I think it's exactly the same, right? If you go into,
Totally agree.
like, say you have a situation where you need to coach or correct somebody, like you just said, right? And you go into it and your intent is for them to change their behavior so that it's less of a pain in your butt.
which
Right.
which is often a temptation in the
Right.
leadership seat, for sure. Yes.
They can feel that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you go into it with the intent of, I want to help you become
Hmm.
better at what you do so you can get a promotion, so that you can make more money, so that you can, have a more fulfilling life, a better life. Right. Uh, that's how I coach and correct people.
Well,
Right.
that's such a great salient example, Clayton. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm so glad you unpacked that in that way. I know of situations where literally, I mean, what you just said is exactly what was going on. And I know this isn't always the case, but in
Yeah.
the example that I'm thinking of, the person had the luxury of time and was conscious of what you just said. And so that leader said, I'm not going to have the difficult conversation with the employee that's not performing until I can say I am totally in this conversation for the other person. Now,
Yeah.
I know that time isn't always on your side and you can't, but in this case, the person could do that. He had to wait 2 weeks. He was so annoyed with the person that he had to wait 2 weeks. But at the end of 2 weeks, he went to have the conversation. And he was, as many leaders, even at very high levels of organization, can get very squeamish about these difficult conversations that need to be
Mhm.
had. Well, he was in that situation as well. But what he found about 30 seconds into the conversation, and I find this just fascinating, is that when he realized that, hey, I actually am in the conversation, not just for this person not to be a pain in my butt, but to actually help them.
Mhm.
This isn't nearly as hard a conversation anymore.
No, it's not.
All of a sudden, he discovered that metaphorically, he wasn't sitting looking at the person. He was sitting on the same side of the table with the person looking at the situation, saying, "Hey, let's talk about this. Let's figure this out. Let me help you." And it didn't mean that there were never any hard things to say, but the conversation itself was a fundamentally different experience for the person delivering the feedback when he realized, oh wait, I really am in it for this other person. Now we just get, and they had a great conversation. They had a wonderful conversation. And when that employee left the company, she snuck into his office and wrote on the whiteboard just this little phrase: "You really know when somebody cares." So that's how that person left the company, the person who was the pain in the butt for that leader. But he had enough consciousness in that moment to just, and he had the luxury of time, and had a completely different experience. By the way, that same leader also has stories in his past where he did the opposite of that. He has moments where he just reacted without pausing based on his own wants and desires, and broke relationships that spent like a year to try to get back to where he was. So he had both experiences. So I love, I love how you've translated that sales idea from James Muir over to leadership. I think you are 100% accurate in how you're looking at that.
Yeah, and I don't think I really realized how much it aligns with your book until just now.
Well, good. That's why we have the conversations. That's why we have the conversations.
Awesome. Well, I know we could probably talk for hours, but we should probably wrap this up. So, Tim, if somebody is interested in learning more about what you do and about your book, how would they get in touch with you?
So the easiest thing on the book is to go to Amazon. So we said, okay, we're playing ball with Amazon. So we went along with that. So that is just The Only Leaders Worth Following. So you can find that in a simple search. And then the website for our company is Be Worth Following. And we also have a podcast by that same name, Be Worth Following.
And it is a fantastic podcast. I think it's my favorite podcast of all the podcasts I've listened to. I really love it. So on behalf of our viewers, thank you, Tim, for joining us. Thank you for sharing your passion on this topic. I'm sure it's going to be impactful for people on their journey. And if today's interview added value to you, please subscribe to this channel for future interviews with experts in the world of business.